the British government can't get its people vaccinated fast enough, and that's true of many of the Western democracies. But China and Russia have been sending millions of doses of their COVID vaccines abroad. It's all about increasing their influence in the post-pandemic world. It's a new great game, which is the topic of our cover story for this week's magazine, written by the Spectator's broadcast editor, host of our Chinese Whispers podcast, Cindy Yu. She joins me now. Cindy, so bottom line, China and Russia, but especially China, using the distribution of its vaccine to developing countries to further its influence on foreign policy.
Yes, it's an obvious thing to try to do when you think about it, because even as early as last year, China and Russia were sending out their PPE donations to other countries when there was a global shortage. China certainly was sending out its own doctors, which obviously at that point had known quite a lot about the virus by March, April kind of time. And now it's vaccines, so this phase is the truly life-saving phase. And what a lot of countries around the world are experiencing is that actually they might have Pfizer orders or they might have AstraZeneca, Oxford orders, but a lot of these deliveries are not reliable and might not even start until later this year, pushing them into the arms of China and Russia, who, at least for China, they're not vaccinating their own people at the breakneck pace I think we could expect China to do, because they're just directing all of their vaccines abroad. So President Xi's vaccination target for late March is only 4% of the population. That's an incredibly slow pace from the country because they see the soft power potential here.
So just to be clear, you could say that soft power let's take China. Soft power for the Chinese leadership, which comes from exporting these vaccines, is some ways is giving greater priority than the regime vaccinating its own people.
Yes, I think so. But, the caveat to that is that China has, according to official figures, defeated COVID within its borders. So obviously there was that January outbreak where 22 million people at one point were in lockdown. But since then, that outbreak has been controlled. Daily figures show maybe less than 5 new cases each day. And so most Chinese people don't feel like they need to be vaccinated anytime soon because they don't feel like they're going to come across it when they go about their daily business. So given there's a lack of pressure from underneath, the Chinese Communist Party is finding it easy to make that calculation to export that abroad.
It seemed, reading your cover story this week, that it's almost like a new scramble for Africa in particular. The Chinese and the Russians going into Zimbabwe was one country you mentioned, going into African countries and offering the pandemic in areas where the Chinese in particular already have some influence. I mean, there's been quite a lot of Chinese involvement in Zimbabwe, for example.
Exactly. Countries like Zimbabwe have amazing natural resources, rare earths that are so important to develop high technology components like mobile phones, electric cars, all that sort of stuff that China controls a lot of the world's supply of. China's Belt and Road Initiative that has been established in the last 5 or so years is essentially building these infrastructural links along with the diplomatic links in order for China to grow faster and bigger. And of course, some of these recipient countries are also getting a good deal out of it, especially the governments in control of it. So as I say in my piece, that a lot of the strongman leaders of the world gravitate towards Beijing's gifts. You've got President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, Mugabe's successor, saying that his country feels greatly honoured by the Chinese donation of vaccinations. You've got President Erdogan taking a picture of him getting jabbed with Sinopharm, one of China's 2 vaccine producers. You've got Duterte, Philippines' very controversial president, who has literally talked about a violent and fatal war on drugs, squeezing hand sanitizer onto the Beijing emissary in a very attentive way. So all these strongmen love Chinese investment, and vaccinations is the one way to prove that China's friendship is worth a lot.
And I thought that was a fascinating point, that China was using the distribution of the vaccine to kind of help bolster strong men, and they're all men, of whom China approves. And that even went as far as the leader of Hungary, who approved Sinopharm, one of the 2 major vaccines that China produces.
Yeah, and Viktor Orban is not one of these countries, he doesn't lead one of these countries that doesn't have, options. He's part of the EU scheme. He doesn't think he's going to get enough jabs that way. So that's why he's turned to Sinopharm. He's also turned to Sputnik, Russia's jab. But with Sinopharm, he goes one step further. He says he's going to take the Sinopharm vaccines at 79% efficacy over the Pfizer one at 95% efficacy, because he says the Chinese have known this virus for the longest. I'm not sure that was quite on brand for the Beijing embassy to hear.
I noticed you said I think it's Sinovac, they've been sending out, even though it's only very recently that it actually got final approval, but it didn't stop them exporting it abroad.
No, and it didn't seem to matter for the countries that imported Sinovac either. A lot of it was done under emergency vaccination schemes, which China, of course, has been using itself to vaccinate up to 1 million people domestically. But yes, you're right. Sinovac hasn't, until this month, it didn't get regulatory approval within China. Even now, Sinovac and Sinopharm are not being regulated for use in the over 60s within China. That hasn't stopped them from being used in the elderly in places like Indonesia. So, there's an interesting question as to, the different regulatory authorities and their different standards, and why the Chinese themselves don't think that their jabs work for the elderly or are safe enough for the elderly just yet. So you've got a situation where Erdogan's been vaccinated, but maybe the 67-year-old President Xi hasn't even been vaccinated yet.
It's interesting, too, when you looked at the question of how does the West respond, because, of course, the democratic pressure in the West is on the governments to vaccinate their own people first before they start sending vaccines abroad. But you give one example of involving the United Kingdom, using manufacturing capabilities in India to produce the Oxford jabs for export to poorer countries in the region. And this was one way of which the West was trying to combat some of the vaccine geopolitics of China and Russia. Tell us more about this Indian venture.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. China, for the last 2 decades, may have been a factory of the world, but India is still the king when it comes to vaccine manufacturing. The Serum Institute of India is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world in pre-COVID times, and they've signed a deal with a few different vaccine producers, among which is the Oxford AstraZeneca jab. They think that they can produce up to 1 billion of this year, and so while the UK's diplomatic focus, or while the UK's nominal focus is on the British citizens, the Oxford AstraZeneca jab has been given to the SII in India to be produced en masse, and the Modi government there is distributing them, especially in Asia. So you've got an interesting situation where India and China are fighting over their neighbours like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And for those two countries, India has won over, and those two countries have opted for the Oxford jab instead. You've also got an awkward situation where it seems like the Oxford jab might not be universally applicable in the sense that in South Africa, where the new strain has come from, the Oxford jab doesn't seem as effective. So India did export some to that country, but now it doesn't seem to be really working there. Sputnik has applied for approval in South Africa, so you can see that China and Russia are never far behind.
No, indeed. Just finally, Cindy, we've seen the British working in India to do something which is not designed to counter China or Russia, but it could have that effect. Am I right in thinking we haven't heard anything from the Biden administration about this yet?
Yeah, so the Biden administration, on the first day of him coming in, symbolically kind of stopped their departure from the WHO in a sort of, we're not Trump way. And they also joined in COVAX, which is the WHO's Developing World Vaccine Scheme. They threw some money at it, but it's not nearly enough. America has also ordered, like many other high-income countries, many more vaccines than it will ever need, which adds to the pressure, the supply pressures around the world. And America, I think, is Biden himself, he aims to vaccinate all Americans by July. So the focus is very much like the British focus on the home turf, which has led to long-time American allies like even Mexico to turn to Sputnik for help because they can't get their hands on any Pfizer. So I think the question is this: before Biden came into power, there was all this talk about how Trump was the obstacle to this international alliance against China in particular. Now that Biden is in office, what is he actually doing that's different to unite these Western countries to see off this Chinese challenge? And it doesn't seem like there's much going on there at the moment.